14 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I would start this week. The first guy, Greg Zeroline of the Dallas Cowboys. So Zeroline here, he's been pretty solid over the last few weeks for the Cowboys. And obviously the Cowboys, one of the better offenses in football this season. So where Zeroline's going to get many opportunities. 11 at Kansas City, 10. Week 12 versus the Raiders, 5. And week 13 at New Orleans, 11 fantasy points. So this week here, Washington, I could see this ball game being in the mid-20s to high 30s between these two division rivals. Or I could see it even being a low-scoring type of ball game where it's a grinded out for both teams, and Zeroline's going to have attempts at 3 or 4 field goals. But either way, I think Greg Zeroline has another good game and reaches double digits again this week at the position. The next kick is Randy Bullock of the Tennessee Titans. So Randy Bullock, he's been pretty solid this season with the Titans. After the last few years, he struggled. I know the last few weeks here hasn't been good for Bullock, but he's definitely a kicker that could bounce back, and he's got a great matchup in week 14 versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. I give up the 6 most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Week 10 versus New Orleans, 10 fantasy points. Week 11 versus Houston, if you play missed PATs, -1. And then the same thing in week 12 versus New England. He made an extra point and missed an extra point with -1. But right here, with the week off, good matchup versus Jacksonville, I think he gets back on track. And right now, he's available in 94% of fantasy leagues here is Bullock. And this is a Titan team with a lot of injuries where I could see them settling for a decent amount of field goals as well in this one. The next kicker I would start this week's Brandon McManus of the Denver Broncos. So Brandon McManus has a great matchup versus the Detroit Lions that give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season here. So Brandon McManus, the last few games, he really hasn't done much. Week 10 versus Philly, 5. Week 12 versus the Chargers, 4. And Week 13 at the Chiefs, 4 fantasy points. But right here, the Lions, like I mentioned, it's the matchup of all matchups, giving up the most points to kickers on the season. And McManus right now, he's available in a whopping 73% of fantasy leagues. But easily versus Detroit, I could see him scoring double-digit fantasy points. The next kick is Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So people were worried with Joseph after that down ball game in week 12 at San Francisco with only 2 points in that one. But Joseph, for the most part this season, he scores easily anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points. Week 10 at the Chargers, 10 fantasy points. Week 11 versus Green Bay, 7. Week 13 at Detroit, 10. And now right here, the great matchup in week 14 versus the Steelers in a game that I could see a mini shootout. And most Viking games are shootouts this season where he's getting 2 or 3 attempts at least is Joseph with a few extra points as well. So the Vikings here are at home in this game, indoor game, Thursday Night Football. And the Steelers do give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers. So I think in this one, Greg Joseph has another good fantasy day, anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points. And the 5th and final kicker I would start this week, Matt Gay of the Los Angeles Rams. So Matt Gay, solid kicker this season, and last week was the best week of the season for him in fantasy football. So the last few weeks for him, week 10 at Frisco, 4 points, week 12 at Green Bay, 8, and week 13 versus Jacksonville, 15 fantasy points. So I know this week on paper it's not a great matchup at Arizona that gives up the 4th least amount of fantasy points to kickers, but this ball game definitely has a shootout written all over it between these two NFC West competitors here going at it with the Rams and the Arizona Cardinals. So these two rivals here, it's going to be a big game, I believe. A lot of scoring. In the Week 4 matchup, we saw them lose with the Rams, 37-20 to Arizona. But I think this ball game is going to be closer, and I could see it in the high 20s to mid-30s. So that's a few kickers I would start here for Week 14 of the fantasy football season.